Hi, it's Kevin Lebates here, and today I thought I would talk a bit more about the concept of ownership. It's something that is pretty innate in people, and an awareness of ownership arises fairly early on in children. I've noticed this from personal experience by looking at my kids at the young age of 3 or 4, fighting over whose toy is whose. The word mine seems to appear surprisingly early in their vocabulary. So ownership is interesting. You can look at it from a psychological perspective, or you can look at it from a legal perspective. However, most of us have some kind of understanding as to what it actually involves. And the thing to be aware of with ownership is that really it boils down to control. If you own something, you have control over it that somebody else does not. And this leads me on to custodianship. When you own something and then you put that thing that you own into custody, for example, you have money and you put it in a bank account, and then you are giving up some of that control. So in a sense, you're giving up some of the ownership. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, this means that the custodian can censor some of the transactions that you want to undertake with the possessions that you own. For example, if you have money in the bank and you decide for whatever reason that you want to send it to a known terrorist organization, well, then the bank will probably pretty quickly censor that transaction. And one of the things about true ownership is that it should be tied to the freedom to do what you like with your possessions, regardless of the fact, or regardless of whether your intentions are to do something that is right or something that is wrong. It's kind of part of the choice of freedom, is the freedom to do things that other people find unacceptable. And one of the things I want to look in today as well is that there are different kind of things that you can own. When it comes to the physical world, it's pretty clear. If you have a £5 note in your wallet, that's a physical entity. You have a piece of paper in your possession and you can decide to hold on to it, or you can decide to take it out of your wallet and pass it on to somebody else, the activity that we call spending. Now, when you look in the world of abstract property, for example, intellectual property, it gets a bit more complicated. For example, if you have an invention and you have a patent for that invention, then the patent is an abstract entity, and abstract entities can't be carried around in your pocket. So the record of the fact that you own it needs to be stored somewhere. And for example, a United States patent, there is a database at the USPTO where the assignee of the patent is recorded. So you're using a ledger in order to keep track of who owns abstract property, and this gives you a means for recording in a community which members of the community own particular abstract property. There are examples of abstract property that are not recorded in a ledger. So, for example, copyright ownership arises naturally from having produced the work. As long as you can provide evidence that you were the person who put together a particular sequence of words in order to make a novel, then according to the Berne Convention on Copyright, you are the copyright owner. However, if you need to prove that later in court, it will be extremely helpful if you have actually practically registered your copyright with the copyright registry of that country, and different countries do have different registries for that very purpose. So how does this all tie into blockchain and cryptocurrency? Well, cryptocurrency or tokens are abstract entities. You cannot hold a Bitcoin, you cannot physically get your hands on an ERC20 token. So we use the same technique for recording who owns which cryptocurrency or which token. We use a ledger, and that ledger is the blockchain. Now, it's not stored in a traditional format, for example, like a spreadsheet or an accounting book or something like that. However, the two can be compared. The data structure of a blockchain can actually be extracted and put into a spreadsheet, for example, showing which, if we're taking Bitcoin as an example, which Bitcoin address has what balance. And so when you own some Bitcoin, for example, it's effectively like owning the row in a distributed ledger. Instead of there being a central authority that owns the right to manage and maintain the ledger, The ledger is distributed across many nodes. It's decentralized. There's no one entity who is in full charge of that ledger, and you as a Bitcoin owner, if you're fortunate enough to be in that situation, effectively own a row in that ledger and can decide what happens to the data in it. And that row would have a Bitcoin address and something. It's a bit more complicated. There'll be some people who will pipe up and say, Bitcoin transactions don't quite work like that. But for all intents and purposes, the Bitcoin address has balance associated with it. And provided you own the private keys, that gives you control over that line in the ledger. And that means that you, as the owner, have the right and the ability to decide whether to hold on to that Bitcoin or whether to pass it on to somebody else. And that is the sense in which you own Bitcoin. So this video's gone on a bit longer than I really intended. It turns out that ownership is not as simple as it first may seem when you look at it through the eyes of a 3 or 4 year old, but isn't most of life like that? Anyway, hope you found that video interesting, and I'll see you on the next one soon. Bye for now.